Hello, my name is Phil Easter, historian and writer, also known as the Amazing Memory Man. We're recording this in June of 2022. A few weeks from now will be July 4th, 2022, Independence Day. 246 years ago, the Declaration of Independence was signed on July 4th, 1776. I remember the bicentennial celebration of our country 46 years ago in 1976. I was 23 years old then, and it was a tremendous celebration, that 200th anniversary year, and as I was living in Boston for the first half of that year. Actually, I moved to Boston in May of 1975 and came back on July 1st, 1976, back to Baltimore, which is where I've lived most of my life. But it was a very fascinating time. All sorts of events were going on around the country. And on July 4th, I went over to Washington, D.C., our nation's capital, and there was a big celebration there near the monument, the Washington Monument, a crowd of at least 300,000 people that evening for a beautiful music concert of classical and also patriotic music. And then a few days later, I went up to Montreal, Canada to see the Olympic Games of 1976. Earlier that year, in April, when I was still living in Boston, for the 5th year in a row, I ran the famous Boston Marathon. I did that each year between 1972 and 76. And then later in 1976, in the fall, I ran the New York City Marathon on October 24th. 2 weeks later, November 7th, I ran the marathon in Washington, D.C., which was properly called Marine Corps Reserve Marathon, but anyone could run it. And then 3 weeks after that, on November 28th, I went to Philadelphia to run the Philadelphia Marathon. So I ran and finished 4 marathons in the bicentennial year of our country, and since that was one of my major interests at that time, I was very happy and proud to do that. But you know, when I think about this, only 4 more years from now, in 2026, it'll be the 250th anniversary of our country. Another 50 years since that bicentennial of 1976. It's just amazing, and how wonderful it was that a remarkable group of men, 56 men in Philadelphia, who signed the Declaration of Independence back on July 4th, 1776, as the American Revolution was just underway. Now here's a bit of trivia that might surprise some people. Among those who signed, of course, were John Adams and Thomas Jefferson and Benjamin Franklin. But George Washington did not sign the Declaration on that day. You may wonder why. He was certainly in favor of the Revolution, and he would become our first president some years later after the Constitution was ratified. But the reason was he was a general of the Continental Army, and he was in the field fighting the British around that time. So he was already a general of the army, and he had to be out in the field. And that's why he did not sign the Declaration of Independence himself. Well, there have been many celebrations over the years, and of course in 1876 was the centennial, the 100-year anniversary. And my great aunt, we called her Aunt Maud, she was born that year in 1876. And would you believe, 100 years later, in 1976, Aunt Maud turned 100 years old. So at that point, you know, she was half as old as the United States of America at age 100. That is really something. And she received a special letter from President Gerald Ford around the time of her 100th birthday that year. And she lived 1 more year. She died at age 101. But in my own personal life, I have several July 4ths that were very special to me, mostly in the 1970s, it just so happens. In 1972, on that day, with my girlfriend at the time named Susan, we went over to Washington, D.C. and did two special things. We went to the National Zoo that day, and also we saw a play at Ford's Theater, the famous Ford's Theater where one of the most tragic events in American history took place. On Friday, April 14th, 1865, President Abraham Lincoln was assassinated by John Wilkes Booth. And it was very touching to me to see, you know, even though I was just 19 at that time in 1972, I knew history pretty well even then, and I realized there was one area, the presidential box, where of course no one was allowed to sit, and they had an American flag there, and it was touching. Every now and then during the play I would just look up to that presidential box and think about Abraham Lincoln. What a wonderful president he was, and in my opinion, not just the greatest president, but the greatest single person in American history. And 2 years later, in 1974, I spent much of that summer on Cape Cod, Massachusetts. And I think I arrived on June 30th, the last day of June. I spent all of July and August there, and came back in early September around Labor Day weekend. But on July 4th, I took a boat from Hyannis to the island of Nantucket, and just stayed there for like so many hours, and had a nice late lunch or early dinner somewhere, and took the boat back to Hyannis that evening. But it was a nice little island, Nantucket, and technically in the state of Massachusetts, as many of you know, also Martha's Vineyard, not too far from there. And the next year I would visit Martha's Vineyard around Labor Day weekend in 1975. And then in 1975, on July 4th, I was living in Boston at that point, like I mentioned earlier, and I saw the great concert on the Esplanade, the Boston Pops Orchestra, conducted by a great conductor named Arthur Fiedler. He was born in the country of Austria in the late 1800s, and he came to Boston as a young man, and he was director of the orchestra for pretty close to 50 years, half a century. Remarkable achievement, and I'm so glad I got to see him that one time conducting the orchestra on the 4th of July, the most beautiful concert I've ever seen in my life. They did so many patriotic songs, and they ended, of course, with the Stars and Stripes for Forever. And it was like a big show that night. Church bells and many churches around Boston were ringing at the same time, and there was Army cannon across the Charles River in Cambridge, you know, going up. It was a great show indeed. It was very nice. And as I mentioned before, well, in 1976, the next year, I went over to our nation's capital and saw a concert there. But another very touching 4th of July for me was in 1979, on my wonderful 15-week trip to Great Britain and Ireland, my two favorite countries after the USA. I had a wonderful trip doing all sorts of things between June 26th and October 10th, 1979 in those two countries. And there's a small island called the Isle of Man between Britain and Ireland. It's sort of a commonwealth of Great Britain. And on July 4th, I arrived there on July 4th. It just so happened I took a boat from Liverpool, England, over to the Isle of Man. And my first night on the Isle of Man, I went to a pub, and among the many songs they played were some American songs too. And that was just so touching. I wasn't expecting that in a country far away. Well, we come up again to another Independence Day very soon on July 4th, 2022. And I would hope that all Americans could put aside their differences and just appreciate how wonderful our country is. And in recent years, it seems like there are so many people divided politically to such an extent that it sometimes is hard to have a very proper debate or in a more civilized way, and I think that's really unfortunate. I understand people have different opinions, and we should have different opinions, but I just wish more people could be more courteous in the way they go about their political and philosophical differences. I would hope everyone can come together and celebrate America's wonderful Independence Day, July 4th. And just think, 4 years from now, again, will be the 250th anniversary. And during that summer of 2026, a great sports event, the World Cup of Soccer, will take place in all of North America, really. It's Canada, United States, and Mexico will be hosting games. All three countries will be hosting that great sports event in the summer of 2026. But also, I can only imagine all the different festivities and beautiful concerts will be taking place on the 250th anniversary. So, this is Phil Easter, the Amazing Memory Man, wishing everyone a very happy Independence Day, July 4th, 2022. Thank you, God bless you, and God bless America.